Okay, looking at the SP Plus projections heading into the 2022 season here in the Big 12, OU's had a lot of change,
Yeah.
right? New head coach, new offense coordinator, 15 transfers out, 13 transfers in. And SP Plus is still projecting the Sooners to finish first in the Big 12. Why?
I mean, part of it is because the guys they lost, they replaced with pretty equal production. And so, obviously that G5 to P5 jump, we're gonna learn a lot about that just from OU this coming season. You got a really productive linebacker in TD Roof, a lot of guys like that who, we'll see what they do when they jump to the Big 12. Dylan Gabriel's the same way. He was as productive as you could possibly want him to be. I think I used his 2020 stats for the projections, not last year. I try not to. If you were injured, I try to go to the previous year. But yeah, it's going to be super interesting. Historically, what these projections are generally made up of is recruiting rankings, which OU's been fine at that. Recent history, OU's clearly been fine at that. Even last year, they ended up in the top 15 overall. And then the production piece, which is the blurry part, because does all this production from a different school translate at a new school and everything. It is funny though, because I know exactly why they ended up fifth. It's hard to like trust that just because they're wearing OU helmets and OU uniforms that, OU's recent history actually matters this coming year with a new coach and everything else. So if there's a runaway team in this conference, I assume it's OU. There's reason to believe they won't run away with things. And if they don't, there's like 5 or 6 teams that could be involved in this race, which is going to be a lot of fun, I think.
Have you, just to kind of build on the production thing, have you ever tracked, like, for instance, Jeff Levy's offensive coordinator now at Oklahoma? Mm-hmm. You look at his offense at Ole Miss that he was calling, was fantastic. Production was great, balanced offense. Now he's gone to OU. Does any of that factor in, or do you track that on how different coaches do whenever they go from one conference to another, or just how that typically translates? Because, the talking point for Sooner fans is, hey, offense at Ole Miss was great.
Yep.
Offense will be great at Oklahoma.
Yeah, it's hard. I've never figured out a way to work that into the projections because everything's very zero sum, and to work it into projections, it has to be like almost like a category, like offensive coordinators for the last 3 years average this, and then they go to a new school and blah blah blah. I've never figured out a good way to do that. It was very reassuring with the numbers though, because I mean, obviously the head coach who just left was one of the most proven offensive coaches in the country, and now you're bringing in one. He hasn't obviously been doing it all that long, but you have to say that Levy's one of the most proven offensive coordinators in the country, just from the offenses he's been associated with at Ole Miss and UCF. So I feel pretty good about that. It doesn't work its way into projections, but I do kind of figure OU's going to have, what are they projected, 5th on offense? I kind of figure they're probably going to be a top 10 or 15 offense at worst, even with all these new pieces. So that's something where, yeah, the numbers don't reflect it, but I feel pretty good about it at the very least.
Yeah, you mentioned kind of the expectation that the offense is going to be good. Looking at your projections for the defense, kind of what does that picture look like for Oklahoma?
In theory, it's good because of the amount of experience, because of the amount of production they bring in, again, from the G5 level mostly. So we'll see how that part translates. But it just, there's a lot of experience. I mean, that was one of the problems last year, was pretty dramatic lack of experience in pretty key areas. Not necessarily true freshmen across the board, but a lot of sophomores, especially up front, especially, I guess at the cornerback position too. And so just bringing those guys back and then adding this layer of, the Jeffrey Johnsons and TD Roofs and CJ Coldens of the world, that should result in improvement, especially when you factor in that Brent Venables is, generally associated with good defense, and he'll probably, whatever they're capable of, he'll probably get them to a pretty solid level this year. So they're projected 24th overall. That kind of feels a little aggressive to me. I'd be more comfortable with like top 40 because they were only 58th last year. but you do figure the odds of improvement are good. And to flip back to Levy though, I do one of the interesting things about kind of college football in 2022 is that there aren't many guys who are still using a lot of tempo. Like it's become a very selective thing. Defenses have adjusted to it a little bit more. Not as many offenses seem to find a permanent advantage out of it. Levy, he's probably going to try. It's in his. He was with Heupel, who very much tries tempo still. Kiffin was on the high end of that too. So you figure, you might raise the tempo a little bit. Maybe that helps the offense. Maybe it ends up hurting the defense. I don't know, but that is a factor to consider because Riley wasn't a tempo guy necessarily out of certain situations.
It is interesting how it's fascinating that it's like a new thing now to see offenses get in a huddle.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, what's happening here? What is this? But I don't know. It's interesting. I think there's some benefits from it, but I think the fewer people that do tempo, and this is just kind of a guess, but the fewer teams that do it, the more effective it will be as defenses are not as accustomed to it week by week, so I don't know how that exactly plays out, but I guess one of the things with Oklahoma that's hard to look at, and I know whenever it comes into the projections, I guess it goes through the recruiting rankings, but I feel like offensively we've got a bunch of guys that they're fairly highly recruited guys, but the production isn't going to factor in. But I feel like they could be a big part of the offense, like Javonte Barnes, a couple of the young receivers in Jaden Gibson or Nick Anderson. So how do you look at that, and how do you kind of project what some of those guys are possibly going to do?
Yeah, it is going to be a really interesting depth chart fight this year for a lot of positions on both sides of the ball, I think, because you mentioned Barnes, obviously a very high level recruit. You still got Eric Gray. You got Bentavious Thompson now, the guy from UCF, who was, a mere mid 3-star guy, but has been pretty productive. And you've got a lot of those types of battles, the 4-star freshman versus, maybe a JJ Hester from Missouri who hasn't played a lot, but has a little bit of experience. And especially on defense, where 4-star freshmen basically at least one at just about every position, and then the CJ Coldens of the world and trying to fend them off. So in theory, this is good. You got upside, you got experience, maybe from different guys instead of the same one at the same time. But in theory, this is really good for competition, and the 4-star freshmen who see the field will have beaten out some pretty solid guys and displayed, at the very least, kind of displayed that they have a pretty high floor. And that's really all you can ask for, especially on a defense that is kind of trying to rebound a little bit. Wasn't very good last year, got burned too much, and competition will help.
So before we move on to the rest of the conference, what are the projections saying for OU when it comes to their performance in the conference and then their performance overall for 2022?
Well, if you believe that they're a top 5 team, like the numbers say, then they're favored in every game. Some of those are, only slightly in some cases, like 5.5 points at Nebraska, 8 points against Texas, but double digits in every single other game. So it really, if they're really a top 5 team, the stage is set for a pretty fantastic year. The problem is, are they? Again, just because they're wearing OU helmets, is this an OU team that is really projectable right now? If they're a top 15 team, then they're still going to be favored in most games. But the Oklahoma State and Nebraska and Baylor and Texas games all become a lot closer to toss-ups, and they'll probably drop a couple of those. But no, it really, if they live up to projections, it's going to be a fantastic season. I don't think there's any way around that.
All right. I want to ask another question about your method. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by it. I think it's awesome. So back to the up tempo.
Mm-hmm.
How is that graphed? Is it like the average duration between snaps? Like how do you come up with less people are doing it than before? And how is that, how does that whole thing work out?
Yeah, so the way I generally measure tempo, and it doesn't necessarily go into SP plus by any means. I mean, that's kind of a per play thing overall. But the way I tend to look at tempo is, start with your run pass rate. Obviously, if you're throwing more, you're stopping the clock more, right? With incompletions and throws to the sideline and all that. So if you throw a lot, you're expected to have more plays. But we can kind of basically use your run pass ratio to say, like, on average, you would average, 23.7 seconds between snaps or whatever that number is. And then we can basically look at what you actually did and see, these teams did more, were clearly going faster than the average. These teams were clearly going slower than the average. Stanford's always at the bottom in terms of, what they did versus how fast they did it. But last year, let's see. So last year Tennessee was the fastest team in the country in terms of tempo, because they were basically, what is that, like 20 seconds between snaps, where their run pass ratio suggested it should have been like 25 or something to that effect. So Tennessee was up there. Ole Miss was third with Levy. So clearly, I mean, obviously, he was involved with Heupel and Kiffin. Obviously, Heupel and Kiffin had a large role to play. You still kind of figured that Levy's going to want to hit the gas quite a bit. North Texas was up there. Seth Luttrell. You had Kent State up there. But it really was, as far as power conference programs go, it was Heupel and Kiffin at the very top, and Levy has been involved with both those guys.
Interesting.
Yeah. So they're going to play fast offensively. There's
most likely, yeah.
Yeah. There's no doubt. Okay.